So my name is Adam Ryan. I am the photography curator here at CPW, and I'm very excited tonight to have back for a second time Caleb Stein. Caleb is an artist based in New York. His work has been exhibited and published internationally and is held in the permanent collections of the J. Paul Getty Museum, the MFA Houston, the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center at Vassar, the New York State Museum, the Wynn Art Foundation, the Thomas H. Lee and Ann Tenenbaum Family Collection. His books include How to Move a Mountain, which is coming out this year. Long Time No See, made as an artistic duo with Andrea Arena. American Glitch, which also comes out this year from Gnomic Books with a contribution from David Campany. And these books are held in special collections in museums all over, including MoMA, the Met, Stanford, Yale. Features on Caleb's work have appeared in the New York Times, the British Journal for Photography, Photograph Magazine, the LA Review of Books, The Guardian, Vogue Italia, ID Vice, and other places. Stein's work with Arena will appear in their first solo museum show at the Deichtorhallen in Hamburg in September, curated by Nadine Isabel Heinrich, bringing together their work in American Glitch and the series Long Time No See, with new site-specific sculpture and video installations. Stein's work has been exhibited at the MFA Houston, the Loeb Art Center, Foam, Red Hook Labs, the Curator's Room, the PH Museum, Belfast Photo Festival, Photo Vogue, the Vincom Center for Contemporary Art, Rose Gallery, Palo Gallery, and Vin Gallery. So tonight, among other things, Caleb will be talking about his project down by the Hudson. And this was the project that I first became familiar with Caleb and his work. So please join me in welcoming Caleb Stein.
Thanks, Adam, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. I just did a 4-hour car ride from New York. It said it was going to be 2.5 hours, and it was 4. So I literally parked the car and just walked in. But it's lovely to see you all here, and sorry for being late. So I'm just gonna share some pictures with you today from. Give it a minute. I'm going to share some pictures with you today from a few solo bodies of work. The first section is my ongoing project down by the Hudson, which kind of centers at this very Edenic watering hole by Overlook Drive-In, which is the kind of most lovely drive-in movie theater. And my partner Andrea introduced it to me when we were students at Vassar, like over 10 years ago now, and she encouraged me to photograph there, and eventually I started, and I was really struck by how this is a space where people softened and they really let their guard down. And I mean, no one's really meant to be there. Everyone's trespassing by being there, and I think that probably brings people together a little bit. But, you know, I started to make this work at a time when Dutchess County was really neck and neck between Trump and Clinton supporters. And you could feel that political tension when you walked through the town. But it seemed to dissipate here. So anyway, with that context in mind, here's some photographs. So the work started in a very sort of traditional lyrical documentary form. And I think what's happened over the years is that I don't feel so much of a responsibility to kind of report in a documentary sense. I've had my own relationship with the space for almost a third of my life now, which is kind of a crazy thought. And it feels like a very magical place. So this is a photograph which has some sort of a, oh, here's my dog. He wants to say hello. He does this pretty much every time I give a talk. Hi, sweetie. And now he's gonna go. But I think as I continue to photograph here, I started to think about, well, what are some kind of almost sculptural interventions that I can create into the space? And you'll see in a second, there's another photograph, which is called Forest Portal. And then I started to think, okay, that's the forest portal near the watering hole, but then what does that open up into? So this is just a mirror with a beam of light into a dark spot. But I don't know, it hopefully conveys something about the magic of the space. And I've been kind of toying with this idea of like a magical realist documentary mode, something that plays around with documentary but doesn't get tied down by it. A lot of the people that I photograph are people that I've known for years, but sometimes it's literally an interaction over the course of a day. I'm not really of the belief that photography is important enough to make anyone feel uncomfortable while making a portrait. So it always starts with a conversation and quite a transparent explanation about what I'm looking for, what sorts of context the work may exist in. And most of the time, people respond really well to that because they can see that this is a place that I really love, and they can see the work. And this is also the advantage, I feel, of working with a digital camera, is that you can show people immediately. So, for example, Brayley, he was bathing at this watering hole, and I asked him if I could photograph him, and he said yes. And then I realized that the way he was tilting his head really reminded me of countless paintings of like the Madonna or something. I studied art history at Vassar, and so all those images are kind of stuck in my head. And so I just quickly on my phone pulled up a bunch of these sort of Renaissance references, and he thought it was hilarious. And so we spent the afternoon kind of going back and forth in quite a flamboyant way. So I like to sort of think about photography as a chance to have some sort of playful exchange. It doesn't have to be too serious. This is Tayshawn, who'd come up from the Bronx, and I said I'd love to photograph you. And he said, okay, but I left the city and came up here to move around. So if you're going to photograph me, then you're going to photograph me climbing into trees and stuff like that, because he just kind of had this velocity to him and he wanted to keep moving. I mean, I really do believe that there is something very powerful and healing about water. And sometimes I kind of do my head in thinking about how people have been coming to this creek for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, how many people have fallen in love at this creek? It's probably an unknowable number of people. This was last Sunday, this photograph of Matthew with an unknown number of dogs. I was there on Friday, and he was there. Matthew's part of a throuple, and he was there with his partners and 2 or 3 of their dogs. And he said, "Well, come back tomorrow with all 6 of them." So he did, and he brought a cage for them. But he sort of explained that it's because some of them are still very, very young. And then there was this torrential downpour, and so all the dogs kept sort of trying to find some sort of a corner, even though it's not really a space with corners. And I don't know, I felt very moved by that. This is the sandbank next to the main bit of land. And I think that one of the interesting things about returning to this space is that the actual space itself is so small. I mean, it's probably the size of this room where all of this unfolds. But based on the rain and the heat, this sandbank is either completely covered or... And I think sometimes it can be very useful to set these very clear parameters, and then there's an enormous amount that hopefully can unfold within that. This is Mason, who I've known for like 10 years. I'm really good friends with his father. Some of the Vassar students go. Most of them get sort of laughed at for, you know, being those college kids. But these 4 students, Leo, Lexi, Lily, and Willa, were so lovely, and they had such a close connection to each other, and it was something that I felt very strongly, so I photographed them. I think a lot of the photographs you've probably noticed by now are of men. And I think what I've seen is that, I mean, the watering hole has an effect on everyone that feels quite positive, but particularly men. I've seen men really amp it down the second they come into this space. There's sort of a tenderness that I'm hoping to look for. But there's always this tension between that tenderness and something else. The watering hole kind of centers around this one very majestic tree, which you saw in the first slide, and now you're seeing again. The roots are sort of visible, and I suppose at some point the tree will fall into the water. But for at least the last several generations, it's been a prominent feature. And I know that because people come back and they show their kids and their grandkids the part of the rope swing that they helped to build. A few years ago, I had it to myself for the day because it was raining. And when I got back to our house, Andrea, I was covered in mud and very, very wet. And she sort of made me strip at the door and throw all of it in the washer dryer. That tree is now moved further downstream. So every year, something changes. This was also on Sunday. It was raining so heavily that I took a plastic bag and ripped a hole in it and then created a hood for myself with the lens coming out. It was like 15 minutes of very, very intense rain, and then it cleared. This is the forest portal that I mentioned earlier. This is Nick. So this is another photograph that always makes me smile, because this is Fred and his twin, and in a similar sort of situation to that photograph of Brayley with all the soap in the river. When I saw Fred and his twin, I thought, well, I've seen a lot of photographs of twins, but usually it's very sedentary. It's usually just 2 twins in a very frontal way, kind of presenting the surface of it. But I've never really seen photography tries to deal with how twins are similar or not similar in movement. And I remembered there's this scene which always makes me laugh in the Charlie Chaplin movie, The Great Dictator, where the worker Charlie Chaplin accidentally finds himself in the dictator Charlie Chaplin's private offices. Maybe you know this scene. And then the dictator Charlie Chaplin comes back into his office, and the worker Charlie Chaplin panics and decides that the only thing he can do is pretend to be the mirror image of the dictator Charlie Chaplin. And so in the scene that sort of follows, you see the dictator Charlie Chaplin slightly suspicious, and you see the worker Charlie Chaplin sometimes successfully, but often unsuccessfully mirroring. And I told them this story, and I shared everything I've just shared with you. And then they started to sort of jump around and completely failed to mirror each other. This is Nate. He's a good friend of mine. We hang out there a lot. This is probably my favorite photograph. And it's hard to explain exactly why, but I think it's doing everything that I want a photograph to do. This is Seamus in embryo pose. That's the name of the photograph. That day, I noticed that Seamus was quite quiet compared to sort of how his friends had described him normally. And I went to my friends who were very close to his family and said, well, you know, what's going on? He said, well, his mother just died in a motorbike accident. And this was the same day that Roe v. Wade had been overturned. And here he was sort of really, to me, it felt like he was really kind of curling in on himself, just becoming another rock in that line of rocks. Every year people rebuild that wall so that you can jump in. And that's kind of a communal activity. This is Matthew and Odin. This is one of the first photographs that I made there. This is Emily and Belinda. They told me that this was the first time they'd been swimming in nearly a decade. They'd both been, again, in a major car crash. And this was kind of a landmark moment for them in their recovery. And it, again, made me think about that power of water to heal. And I mean, I know it does things to me, and I've seen it do other things to other people. You know, when you go to the same place, I mean, I must have been 400 or 500 times. When you go to the same place so many times, you start thinking, well, what does it look like from up there? Or what does it look like from all the way down here? And you start to really push to see if you can find another way of showing it. This is Caleb with a K. So whenever we see each other, he says, Caleb with a C, and I say, Caleb with a K. He's a sweet kid. I was really interested, and still am, in the way that it's almost like the first thing guys do when they get there is they have a bit of a tussle. You sort of wonder why. Why is it that that's the way that we're sort of relating to each other? But it's meant with a lot of affection, and that kind of interests me. There's that majestic tree again. So that's the end for now. of that body of work. I'm going to go back tomorrow. This is a more recent series called Men Fighting in the Spaces They Fight In. And in some ways, it's, I think this is one of the lovely things about photography, is that you kind of make a picture that surprises you. And then you think, well, how can I build on that? And so that wrestling and that kind of playful fighting at the watering hole made me think, well, I'd like to look at professional fighters and look for that type of tenderness too. And I'm quite interested in the way that these guys, they could kill you, but they won't. And that's kind of the grace, is that they have that ability. I'm just thinking about, insofar as what photography can offer, how can you try to communicate both of those things, like the toughness of it, but also the softness? So the Jiu-Jitsu place that I've been photographing at, they have a lot of international competitors. And one day I noticed that there was this hole punch in the wall. And I said, what happened here? Apparently, a bunch of them had been in Rio competing, and one of them had been killed. I mean, Rio is famously quite dangerous. And when the rest of the club found out, the guy was so kind of overwhelmed that he put a hole through a wall. And then I started to notice that this is something that happens in many gyms. And I thought, one day maybe there could be a whole grid of hole punches. I'm very interested in the idea that if you photograph something in a very clear-eyed way, you can take something and you can make it kind of feel like a found sculpture. And a lot of these gyms seem to have these elements that almost, to me, feel like found sculpture. So this is a book. It's the PDF for a book, which was published in January by Luhz Press. This is work I made over a 10-day period in Carrara, which is the famous quarry in Italy where Michelangelo and Bernini and lots of other people source their marble. It's a very special type of marble. And I'd been 10 years ago with my family. It was one of the best days I've ever had. And so I realized it was coming up for nearly 10 years since I'd been. So just in kind of a passing way, I just Googled what's going on in Carrara. And then the first thing that showed up was that there's a company called Robotor. I think they've now changed their name to Lytix. And they are using robots to carve marble into sculpture. So I thought, well, how can I go? So I pitched it to Jeff Campagna, who's an editor at Smithsonian, and he helped me to get a commission and to get access. And basically the company arranged for me to photograph the full production arc of one marble sculpture from block form all the way through to finishing touches. The book also includes these screenshots of the 3D schematics that are printed onto a kind of industrial grade tracing paper in between the signatures of the book. I was fascinated by how consistent and confident the robot is. I mean, it knows that a mark that it makes on Tuesday is going to directly relate and set up the mark that it makes on Sunday. And it's not going to get tired or despondent or go for a coffee break. It's just going to work through the night. And I was interested in how it builds a form through these kind of topographic layers. It's incredibly analytical. And so even on a microscopic level, it's kind of reflecting the immensity and magnificence of the land that it comes from. And again, kind of thinking about how if you just photograph something in a clear-eyed way, you can make something industrial look quite sculptural. I mean, this is an idea that lots of my heroes have explored, from Jermaine Cruel to the Beckers and on and on and on. It's so automated for 80% of it that it even deposits the fingers into kind of a register and switches it out for increasingly finer grade points. The finishing touches, I should say, is still done by human hand. Carrara is one of the best sculpture academies in the country, and so they get a lot of people from that academy, but also people from all over the world. And you know, it was interesting going into this space. Basically, they have 6 of these robots, and each of them is contained within one of these monumental plastic bays. So sort of like these walls that it's almost like a privacy curtain. It doesn't have a top, but it's just so that people can't see what's going on, because you have 2 schools of people that are using this technology. You've got the people like Zaha Hadid or Jeff Koons or Kors, and they don't really care if people know that they're outsourcing it. But then you've got the neoclassical sculptors, people who are like doing $1 million commissions for the Mormons and stuff like that. And they really care, and they have NDAs and all sorts of things. And so it was very strict what could and couldn't be photographed. And it's kind of interesting to see how this technology is maybe going to unsettle certain ways of making things. And this may seem like a small thing, but the picture on the right, the diagonal of light on the sort of bottom part, the way that that completely runs parallel to the water that's clearing the dust. I mean, those are the types of things that actually I really love about photography. I think photography really thrives on specificity. And then there are all of these sort of moments of alignment that are useful, because actually when things align formally, it just means that something can be communicated in a very clear-eyed way. It doesn't have to be fussy, but it can feel very complicated to find the simple way of showing something. And that's part of the challenge and the thing that keeps me photographing. On the right, you can see the various ends that are used. It's all diamond ends so that it can withstand the intensity of the stone. I thought it could be interesting to just make a very simple document of this, because I think that we're at a moment where we're really thinking about how AI and automation are going to adjust our conceptions of authorship and what it's going to do for creativity. And the fact that this is happening in a place that is in some ways so tied to a very traditional way of making, but then also realizing that there have always been workshops, and the idea of sort of the sole author has always been complicated. So maybe there actually isn't anywhere that is better suited to have a new technology like this. Here you see the craftsmen. Essentially what the craftspeople are doing is they're figuring out how to smooth the edges out between one topographic layer and the next. There's an enormous amount of skill and interpretation in how one goes about doing that. But it's a, you know, a white glove service, so to speak. I mean, it kind of enables the artist to focus on being an artist at the beginning and the end of the process. David Campany wrote a wonderful essay for the book. And then finally, I wanted to share a selection of single photographs that I've made over the last 10 years. I'm still always just making pictures for the pure joy of making pictures and for remaining open to the world and connected to it. Poughkeepsie was doing these Christmas parades for a long time, and they haven't done them recently, sadly, because they are kind of the wildest Christmas parades I've ever been to. It's like you've walked onto the set of a Fellini movie. It's totally bizarre and very generative from a photographic standpoint, anyway. So I've always had a terrible phobia of snakes, but then I saw that the Mid-Hudson Civic Center, I don't know if they've renamed that now, but there was a reptile expo, and so I went up, I sort of took a Xanax and went in, and there were 7,000 snakes, and I walked right out. And then there was one guy who was carrying a snake in. I said, when you're done with your booth for the day, can you bring your snake and put it on the kind of the court columns and just let it take the form of the columns? And then for about 30 seconds, I was able to forget about my fear of snakes so that I could make the photograph. Then I went back to being terrified again. It's my friend, the writer and poet, Daniel Wolfe. I mean, you can see from what I'm showing you, so much of my activity and inspiration has come from this area. I mean, I think it's such a special place. I mean, you all know this just as well as me, if not better, but I mean, what an amazing part of the world. At the beginning of COVID, I was in London visiting family, and I was commissioned by ID to photograph the early days of the lockdown. So I went to the local Poundland, and there was nothing there. So I've actually started a whole series on car washes. It's a bit early to share that work with you, but there'll probably be a book next year of that work. Basically, when I have to move my car for alternate side parking, and I take it to the Walgreens on Union Ave and park it there, and then across the street is my local car wash, and I've become very friendly with them, and I again take the same approach as with the watering hole. It's a very small space, and I've been about 40 times, and I'm just trying to push myself to find new ways of looking at this. But the reason I even bothered to do that was because in 2018 I made this photograph, and so that's very encouraging, is that even though I'm not always sure what the next project's going to be or what I'm even going to be doing, I think sometimes just the pictures I've already made might suggest where I could go next. Is that wonderful Christmas parade again. Yeah, so that's it. Sorry, I've shown you a lot of pictures, but if you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to try to answer them. No, it's a Leica M10. Yeah.
Can you say that louder?
It's a Leica M10.
Is that monochromatic?
No, it keeps the raw file in color, but then I make the change.
When did that start?
When did what start?
When did you start to photograph in black and white?
Probably 15. I mean, a while ago, a long time ago.
Never considered photographing color or
I have photographed in color, and Andrea Orejuela and I often work as an artist duo, and our book American Glitch, which came out this year, that includes a lot of Hasselblad digital medium format photographs that we made in color, and also found photographs from the internet that most of them are in color. So I think it just depends on the project. I kind of feel like the artist duo practice with Andrea is a space for being very, very open to whatever kind of style or form the project calls for. And then I've seen that with what I'm compelled to do with my personal work, it tends to sort of remain within this type of a world. Yeah.
I noticed that you are talking about a series that you're going to shoot or that you're still shooting. You already see it as a book potential. Does it always work with that for you? Is it always, you know, that it's going to be a book, or how is your series making related to book?
Well, more and more, I'm trying to think about it at the beginning so that I can think about it alongside making the work. But not everything is a book. I don't think that men fighting in the spaces they fight in will be a book. I think that could be a show of 12 prints that I would feel I'd have an uncomplicated relationship to a show of 12 prints from that. But I have no desire to make a book of that. Whereas for me, the big thing has been, okay, I've been working on Down by the Hudson for 10 years now. I've done 3 books. Down by the Hudson is still not a book. That's a whole story. You know, could get into that. But I've found that maybe it's a good thing that it hasn't become a book yet, because it means that I keep going back. And books have this way of kind of closing things down after a certain point. I don't know many people that keep making the same type of work for a project after they've made a book. So, I mean, Down by the Hudson, it will be a book. Whether it's in my lifetime or not is another question, but I do think about it as a book, and I think that books are a great form for photography. It's probably my favorite form for it. And it's kind of like a world building exercise. I mean, it's a really special thing. But I don't think everything has to be a book. And sometimes, I mean, the How to Move a Mountain work in Carrara, didn't know. I mean, it was just a 10-day commission, and I had no idea if I would make something that I would even like. I just wanted to try. And then afterwards, I thought maybe I could do something with this. So it depends. Yeah.
over Down by the Hudson, you said you wanted to work with a documentary.
Mm.
Is that a known genre?
Oh yeah, very, very. There's so many people.
Is that?
Yeah, probably same. Yeah.
What's your understanding of that? Style?
I mean, my understanding of it is that it's, I mean, maybe someone like Adam could chime in about now, but my understanding is that it dates back to the 1930s, and Walker Evans, I think it's a term that he came up with, if I got that right? Or lyrical documentary, or is that something that came later?
It was ultimately about he was appropriating style.
Yeah, exactly.
Photographs that were only made for the purpose of documentation. And then he took that style and his artistic practice.
Yeah.
He wasn't the first to do so, but the most influential.
Yeah.
I think it's a lovely way of kind of using language to try to wrap one's head around doing something that does have some sort of relationship to the real world and is an embrace of the constraints of that, but it's also making an argument for how it can still be a very expressive form. And I think I often think about what Adam just said. I mean, I often think about that Walker Evans photograph of the crushed tin column. Has anyone seen that photograph? And I think about it because, I mean, the crushed tin column is like a kind of neoclassical, it's like some bit of architecture that's been borrowed from thousands of years ago, and it's in the US in the 1930s. But the photograph is not neoclassical. It's a modernist photograph. And I don't know, there's something to that. There's something about pretending that something's a little bit objective or leaning into things that are understood as objective when it's anything but, that feels really fruitful and useful for me. Also, I think, you know, my father is a minimalist architect. My grandfather was an art director and a painter who his professor was Alexei Brodovich. So it's like there's a certain sensibility of like the New York Jew that is very much in my DNA, even if I've been back and forth between London a lot. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So, can you clarify, can you show that one photo used a mirror and a light reflecting on it? Or you said that you were looking for kind of a light and inspiration for the water. Did you use any techniques like that after, or was that just something to get you over into looking at things?
Maybe that. I mean, there's not many pictures where I've kind of intervened in that explicit of a way, but it felt useful. I mean, in 2022, I found a circular mirror that someone had painted onto, and I brought it to the watering hole, and there was a tree that a bear had kind of done a back rub against to the point where the tree had kind of been broken down, and I balanced that mirror on it. And then it's just a picture that stayed with me. And I thought, well, I want it to open up into something because it does feel magical, and the space started to feel more and more magical. And that kind of gave me the courage to experiment more than I might have otherwise. Thank you for the question. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you speak to your property or frame?
Whatever the picture calls for. I remember someone telling me that Lizette Modell would crop her images sometimes. It was 1/32 of a frame. And actually, I even after hearing that, I kind of hesitated in the way that I also hesitated to kind of bring things into the space. But then Andrea, many years ago now, said, okay, give me this picture. It was two men fighting, and she made a radical crop. And it was like, oh, you can do this, and it's fine. And she just sort of like gave me permission to do it. Yeah. So whatever's necessary to get to something that feels good. Yeah. Yeah. Whatever it calls for. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. It depends. Some people are like, what are you doing here? You know, like, why are you here? I don't know. I think maybe it means that people can't like locate me as easily, and maybe that's sometimes useful and sometimes not. I mean, compared to the rest of my family, I do not have a very strong accent. So sometimes people really are like, where are you from? Are you from Australia? Or so maybe it like puts a question mark in people's head, and then they linger long enough for me to explain what I'd like to do. Maybe it's useful. I picked Vassar, but very quickly fell in love with Poughkeepsie. Yeah, I think it's a special place. Any other questions or thoughts?
A lot of the portraits in Hudson are the subjects are mostly the Asian type
Mm.
things like that. In that particular project.
Often, yeah, because I think I'm interested in some sort of a radical vulnerability. I think eyes hold a lot of that. So if there's a way of getting someone to look at the camera to the point where it looks like they're looking right at you, that can be very helpful sometimes, but not always. Sometimes it's very good to not see eyes so that you can kind of be left to imagine a bit more. But especially if there's someone that has a very powerful energy that I'm responding to, then it does have a lot to do with the eyes, for sure. There's a lot in the eyes.
I'm just curious, because it feels a little bit more like, it feels like an icon, a little. So where the other pictures that you have where maybe you're out on the side a little bit, it feels like there's a little, I feel like you're being taken, not necessarily there. So I just find that interesting in the way that you're trying to do this purpose.
Thank you for that comment. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I am putting myself in the pictures, and it's a document of how I saw something or how someone responded to me. And I do think that it's a space that opens people up. It definitely opens me up, and I want to make a record of that when it feels very strong. Yeah, that's important to me. Yes, sorry, I know you had your hands raised for a while.
I want to know, like, why you photograph in black and white, particularly for like the Hudson River swimming hole. Like, because I would love to see what it looks like in color. Because I feel like nature comes across the different shades of green.
Yeah, it's true. It is very beautiful. I mean, I've never made a photograph there that I felt good about in color, just on a very basic level. It hasn't felt right, but I think that I think black and white is really useful because it kind of removes something a little bit from what one might expect, and that jolt of expectation is a really good way of hopefully getting people to look a little bit longer. And I'm also interested in the way that a photograph can look like it was made 100 years ago or tomorrow. And, you know, what are the sorts of photographic languages that are the most enduring, and how can they be used to explore a certain concept? So for How to Move a Mountain, you know, it's a space that's really challenging tradition. Felt very useful to work with black and white because I think we all have a collective sort of visual shorthand for black and white. Like if there's a movie in color and all of a sudden there's a scene in black and white, we all are kind of programmed to know that that refers to the past. So it feels useful. And for Down by the Hudson, for me, feels timeless. And so that's why, I mean, people hopefully will always be going there, and people have gone there for many, many generations. So how to sort of show that in a way that can hopefully convey it. That's why. But, you know, I try to stay open to every photograph. So if there ever is a photograph that feels like it should be in color, I'm going to remember what you said, and I'll try and stay open to it, I promise. Thank you. Bye.
Going back to your portrait, you have your subject and smile or color that
I mean, I don't say to them, this is art, because I don't know if it's going to be any good when I'm making it. So I don't do that. But no, so there are pictures of people smiling from time to time. But usually I'm looking for a quieter space. I'm not looking necessarily for something melancholy or certainly not gothic, but I am looking for something quiet and contemplative. And sometimes a smile is a guard. I mean, I've seen photographs made by some of my heroes with laughter that feels very raw and genuine. I mean, William Klein knew how to photograph people laughing in a way that does not feel cheesy or like the person who is being photographed is sort of putting up a guard. It feels like it's just this big expression of energy in life. So if something like that were to come along, I'd be really open to it. But yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of these projects will somehow approach wrestling, either explicitly or as part of the Hudson project, is that right?
I think I can see that it runs through it. And I am interested in photography's relationship to sculpture and how the body is like a sculptural form. And I think it goes back to that attempt to grapple with something that's soft, but also strong. And so maybe on that level, but I mean, I'm not super interested in Greco-Roman stuff. It's I mean, for the most part, really, really old things tend to freak me out because they all sort of develop this kind of yellow film with age that sort of flattens everything. So I'm not so interested in Greco-Roman sculpture. I don't know why. I think I knew that it would be a surprising enough situation that it would surprise me long enough to not be terrified. And that word surprise actually is really important. I was just listening to this great interview with the painter Frank Auerbach and John Wilson on BBC Radio 4. And he was saying that that's what he looks for, is to be surprised. That's the only metric, is to be surprised, to surprise yourself. Because photography can process so much more than the brain can in an instant. So hopefully the photograph is better than I am and surprises me. That's something I do think about. Yeah.
I'm just curious because I'm just seeing how long you've been on that. What do you think is like maybe the most important thing that you do different in your approach?
I think it's calmed me down a lot. I think, I'm about to be 30 and I was 19 the first time I went. I had a lot more anger and impatience and I think it's dialed it back. I mean, it's a big part of falling in love with Andrea. It's a big part of that relationship. It's a big part of waiting for good things to come. And some, early on they didn't. And that was really frustrating. And I think just seeing that if I kept going, good things could come sometimes. I think that's taught me to have a bit more patience and trust in the process. And just by showing up, and good things can happen. So I think it's softened me. It's made me a bit more patient. It's definitely made me a more quiet observer. I just wait a little bit more than before. I think it's really taught me a lot about life and how to look. It's definitely the most meaningful work I've done for me. Yeah, thank you. Any final questions? That's probably quite a good one to end on, really. Unless there's any. Okay. Thank you.